Hello and welcome to week 3 of Communication Conflict Resolution. As you know, I am your instructor, Mike Betker. That's my contact information there. And obviously, you guys now know email is a pretty good way to get a hold of me and talk to me. I also have office hours Monday, Wednesday from 2 to 4:30. Would love to see you guys in person if you need to. I'm always there, so let me know. Let's press on here. So as we always we'll start out with this things to make and do chart here for week 3. And a lot going on this week. So obviously if you're watching this video, you're off to a good start. So you'll want to watch this video first, which will take you through a few things. We're going to kind of we're going to discuss more about groupthink. We're going to talk about the difference between dialogic and active listening. And then we're going to get into the second half of chapter 2, which is about discerning your conflict style or conflict styles in general. We'll talk about those. Here are some of the things that are due this week. So we got a lot going on. That's why I want to get this out to you guys on Friday, so you have a good 9 or 10 days to react to the content before you have a lot of things due. So everything's due, obviously, for the most part, with the exception of the post, your conflict style post, which is due this coming Thursday, February 7th. So you got the post on Thursday. You got a reading quiz it's due by the 10th on Sunday at 11:59. You also have a test, our first test on Chapter 1, Chapter 2, second half, the handout, and information regarding groupthink. We also have a thought piece due. So this is a pretty heavy-hitting week. I would say most weeks are not going to be this busy. Just how it shook out this week. But that's what's going on this week in a nutshell. Let me know if you have any questions, and we're going to press forward here. A couple things I want to talk about before we get going here. The recap of the course so far. Have received some good feedback from you guys on a lot of things, and I appreciate that candid sort of communication, obviously largely through email, but I really enjoyed reading your first posts and very encouraged by the amount of sharing you guys are willing to do here. So I love that interaction, and I love, obviously, when people respond to posts as well. So I have read everybody's posts, and we'll continue to do that. And obviously we'll be engaged in some of these going forward here as well. But loved what you guys did, so keep up the good work. Generally, I thought collectively you guys did a really nice job with that first post. Those of you who missed points, most likely it's because you neglected to respond to some of your colleagues, your peers, your posts. And obviously, post is one piece, but then of course responding to 2 of your peers' posts is important to that full 25 points. Reading quiz number 2 is coming up, obviously, this Sunday. Like I mentioned, that's largely on Chapter 2, second half. And we've got thought piece number 1 due this Sunday. My goal is to get a new video out every Friday, so you have some time to react to those. So there were some questions around that, what the plan is for this course. My goal, I'm mindful of everybody's situation. I think everybody here selected an online course primarily for that asynchronous, which basically means I want to work on the project or the class when I can because of my schedule. So I'm perfectly mindful of that. That's kind of why I set it up, so that we have, the discussion posts on Thursdays, which I think helps you set you up for success with some of the other projects later in the week. So that's kind of the goal here. I like to get these videos back to you guys at some point in a reasonable time on Fridays, so you can work the weekend and then have another full week and another full weekend to complete the stuff for the week. All right, thought piece 2. Let's introduce that a little bit. That's also, of course, now you'll see Module 2, that's obviously in Module 2, and what we're looking here to do 2 things. Now, if you look on pages, I think it's 35, 36, somewhere around there, you'll find this conflict style assessment tool. I'd like you to take that out. Now, obviously, you don't need to sully up your book. You can actually go on into the module, and you'll find that I've scanned this test for you, so you can just print that off and use that. But I'd like you to take that self-assessment tool and use that as a foundation for kind of some of the stuff we're doing here. So you'll do that, and then of course the second part of that will be to take account of your conflict assessment results. Now I'd like you to balance what you got for results with your own thoughts about your style, because that may differ. Sometimes these tests are not accurate, but I'd like you to do that and follow directions here. Obviously you're looking at 2 pages again. We're looking at roughly 500 to 600 words double spaced, 12 points of font size, and of course you want to watch your spelling, grammar, and sentence structure. So all right, so we do have our first test coming up. So not to be alarmed, it's worth 50 points, 25 questions, so 2 points apiece. It's a combination of true, false, and a lot of multiple choice. And there's one actually at the end. There'll be one question that's open-ended that you'll have to respond to. But that's the test writ large. Here is this, and this is also, by the way, this is on Canvas, so you can download this there. But I'll share this quickly with you. We're going to talk about, chapter 1, pages 4 through 13, and we can culminate there with groupthink and symptoms and prevention strategies, which we'll talk about today in this lecture. Then also we're going to talk about listening, so active versus dialogic listening and what that means, and then of course the relationship between sympathy and empathy with those two. Again, we'll talk about that in this lecture as well. And then the last section, which is really the lion's share, I'd say, for this upcoming test, really focuses on the different types of conflict style management. So you got avoiding, accommodating, competing, compromising, and collaborating. They're the 5 big ones there. And we'll discuss that. We'll break that down from the chapter. So that's kind of it in a nutshell, and that's that first test, and this is your first test study guide. Okay, let's quickly talk about groupthink again, one of my favorite topics in this course. Groupthink, obviously, here's a picture of a sheep, and that's kind of funny in a way because it's really how people behave in these situations where they are often overwhelmed by the group dynamic. In other words, you often have a powerful leader who kind of leads the charge, and usually it's a leader who values loyalty over critical thinking. And so that can lead to a lot of problems, as we know. And by now you've probably seen the video I shared with you guys regarding the Challenger shuttle explosion. And we'll go through a few other examples of that today as well. But that's kind of the worst case scenario where people lose their lives because opinions are squelched by the need for cohesion, or the desire for cohesion. So quickly reviewing this again, Irving Janis is the proprietor, or the person who came up with this theory. More often than not, it's very prescriptive, and you graduate students probably know what that means, since it has an application in the real world. So results when groups have too much cohesiveness. So in other words, it's really a result of that. Now, conversely, cohesiveness doesn't automatically mean the group suffers from groupthink. Obviously, there's plenty of groups out there who get along great, who still make great decisions, and are okay with sharing their unfettered opinions about what's right and wrong or what's indifferent. So know that cohesiveness is just one clue or indicator, but it's not the end-all be-all. All right, what happens in groupthink? There's 6 here I want to share with you guys. First thing, as we know, the group limits discussion to only a few alternatives, right? So it's like, here are a couple things, the only ones we're going to accept. There may be 15 other things you could do that might be better, might present a better option, but because the group is suffering from this cohesiveness overload, they don't even entertain those. The number 2, the first idea selected is never re-examined for flaws. So if you get that great idea, that first idea, that's why I always advocate for lots of ideas, and you want to have those and debate those vigorously, versus coming up with a great idea first and then not even thinking about it anymore, because you'll leave things out that may be a shame. 3, minority opinions are quickly dismissed and never re-examined. Right. So if you're the minority person in a party, and you've been dismissed in the past, you're more likely not going to say anything next time around, right? So ultimately, like I said before, these dissenting opinions or the minority opinions are often squelched by the need for cohesion. Number 4, expert opinion is not sought. Again, you don't bring any from the outside. A good example of this, I would say, and this may be political for some of you, but ultimately the idea that global warming is not happening is just a shame when 99.9% of all scientists suggest that it is. In spite of that, we have still some dissension here around that idea, and obviously the expert opinions are being ignored. So that's one example of many, I would say. Number 5, information gathering is highly selective. So again, you have this filter placed upon the group that says, all right, these are the only things we believe in, and everything else is going to be filtered out. So you're just not allowing anybody to be exposed to any alternative messages. Last but not least, of course, and we know this to be the case, if you got a plan and suddenly everything goes sideways, which can happen, they're caught with their pants down because they don't have any other contingency plans in place. So that's often a case. That's the result of what happens in groupthink. As we know, we've probably not seen the story, and maybe you lived through it. I did, actually. I lived through this. Groupthink it was in full display with regard to the Challenger explosion, where they decided to skimp on materials, specifically these things called O-rings, which they knew were defective at a certain temperature. And if the temperature dropped to a certain point, these O-rings would fail, and of course that's exactly what happened. It was traumatic, and this is a video here, a clip of a video. Obviously the second in line there is Krista McAuliffe, who is a school teacher. And thousands of students, hundreds of thousands of students across the country were watching as this Challenger went up and quickly exploded. So a horrible situation, awful to watch, and it happened on national news. So really, really one of those moments in life that you remember, like 9/11, that you remember. And if you were too young to remember that, I would tell you, you can watch the video and you'll kind of get a feel for it. Other examples of groupthink, Bay of Pigs, as we know, or maybe you don't know. President Kennedy inherited a situation from Eisenhower's administration, and he basically took for rote what they had said about the Cubans in that whole situation where they applied stereotypical thinking, and they listened to CIA stuff without questioning it. So they took it in unfettered, and actually it almost caused a nuclear war. We were very close to this massive situation with Russia and Cuba. The bombing of Pearl Harbor, another example of that, where senior officials, in spite of warnings from Washington, D.C. about potential invasions of Japan in Pearl Harbor, they ignored that and were caught completely unaware based on that. So that this feeling of invulnerability being out there in the middle of nowhere at Pearl Harbor cost them. The collapse of Swiss Air, more of a business-related example. Swiss Air obviously was an airline once upon a time that was so financially solvent they were called the Flying Bank. So it really, really started believing their own press and ignored some of the facts about what was going on. And obviously, if you know anything about the airline business, it's cutthroat, and it's hard to make a buck in airlines these days, especially. But that they were kind of caught unawares. And of course, last but not least, the mass resignation of the Major League Umpires Association is one example where members resigned in 1999, attempt to gain stronger negotiating position. And they overestimated the resolve of the unity of the members. In other words, they thought, oh, come on, let's go. We're all going to do this. And, of course, people, after a period of time, lost their resolve. And so the people miscalculated the strength of the group that way. That's, again, another example of groupthink. All right, 8 symptoms, quickly. Illusion of invulnerability, right? So we know what we're doing. Nothing can go wrong. Everything's hunky-dory. And then, of course, the wool is pulled from their eyes, and they realize that's not the case, right? That's the first one. Second, unquestioned belief in the group's inherent morality, right? We're the good guys. We have the high moral ground, right? And you hear this a lot, more than I care to admit, but especially with regard to religion, if you think about this ones. From a lot of wars are fought right and around religion, and we're the right ones. We're the ones chosen by God and others, right? So that's the other piece. This idea that we can't, our way is the best way and the most moral. Number 3, collective rationalization. The group creates a story to support their decision. So often you get this false narrative that supports kind of the group's kind of go-to-action plan. Number 4, stereotyping people outside the group. So in other words, painting others as evil. It happens all the time in politics and everything else. So anyone outside the group is viewed or couched as wrong or evil. And again, you see a lot of that in politics. Number 5, self-censorship. Members prevent themselves from saying what's on their minds. So if you know cohesion is the most important thing in the group, and if call attention to someone's bad breath in a group, and that's not something you want to do, or let's say it's the president of the group or the high up of the group, and you tell them that's obviously not going to bode well for you, so you self-censor. Illusion of unanimity. This is where the group wants to appear everyone is in agreement, right? So in other words, yes, yes, yes. Secretly, you're saying no, no, no. And last time I believe we showed a cartoon of that where everybody did not agree, but yet agreed anyway verbally. Direct pressure on dissenters, right? Members are strongly encouraged not to disagree by others. And in some cases, you got mind guards who play that role, right? And if you see the video for the Challenger explosion piece, you had some of that going on. You had some mind guards encouraging other members to kind of make the right decision, quote-unquote right decision, which was the wrong decision. Last but not least, self-appointed mind guards. Mind guards protect the leader from troubling ideas. So there's a filter that really protects the cohesion and the current state of the group. So that's kind of some symptoms of groupthink. So if you see some of these, you'll kind of know. Now, 12 Angry Men is a movie, obviously, and I'm a movie guy, as you now know. I love movies. This is a fantastic movie, obviously black and white, and that's Henry Fonda there, kind of center there next to the pack of smokes. But this obviously is centered around, if you haven't seen the movie, you should. But it centers around the indictment of a young man who committed a murder, and there's 11 guys here who emphatically debate that. Now, Henry Fonda plays the role of the dissenter, the only one in the group who disagrees, or at least thinks there should be debate, some rational debate, which is really how you overcome groupthink, right? So take a look at that clip. That's actually in the module. So how do you prevent it, right? So one way to do it, you can't always just have Henry Fonda in your group, right? But maybe you should play that role of Henry Fonda, right? And always question. So let's talk about some of the things you can do, right? First, you can assign all members as critical evaluators. That's the key. You can say, all right, I as a part of this group, I want you to challenge me at every turn, right? Not to be annoying or not to submarine things, but certainly to ask the critical questions so that you don't make mistakes. Number two, leaders need to express thoughts carefully, right? So that's the key. Now, if you're a leader, you obviously hold a lot of power, and people will be reticent to share their honest opinion with you unless you let them know there will be no reprisals for your honest opinion, right? In some cases, that they say that, but they don't mean that. So you got to make sure, as a leader, you got to make sure that they know you're not going to get castigated for your opinion. Number three, break into independent discussion groups. A smart way to do that, right? Let's say you got a leader in the room and there is some concern about whether that person is going to judge you unfairly for your opinion. So breaking into smaller groups and kind of combining forces in a smaller group is an easy way then to present that back so that you share responsibility and bring that message back to the leaders. Number four, discuss group projects with people outside the group. Another smart thing to do is go to different disciplines. In other words, I used to have meetings, marketing meetings, and we'd bring people from different disciplines like sales, for example, or engineering even in some cases, where they would give you their unvarnished opinion about the truth. And maybe it's not right, but either way, you got another point of view at it. Number five, toward that end, call experts from outside the group. So bringing people in to weigh in. Folks who may know a lot more about a topic than the average person, right? Bringing that in can actually really, really help. Number six, assign a devil's advocate. I've done this before in my meetings. Have somebody just automatically wear the black hat. And when I say black hat, the person who really was always kind of focused on the other side of it. Like, what about this? And what about that? Did you consider this? All those kinds of things, and things that maybe you wouldn't think about normally, particularly if you're in the grips of focused on cohesion. Number seven, hold a second chance meeting before making any final decision. That's smart. Like, sleep on it, right? Take a day or 2 days or a week. And then come back to it again and rehash the final decision before you make that final decision. And last but not least, always have a contingency plan. And invariably you see in these groupthink situations where bad things happen that they don't have a backup plan because they never thought that anything else would be needed because they were right. All right, quickly, I just want to share this on the Cuban Missile because I think it's interesting. I like the historical background of this. But Kennedy actually took to heart what happened there. I mean, obviously, we had just narrowly avoided a massive nuclear war with Russia. But Kennedy took a lot of measures to kind of overcome groupthink moving forward. So he created what's called XCOM, which included people from LBJ's, his cabinet, Robert Kennedy, his brother, and members of his cabinet as well. He kind of cross-pollinated that so that they played devil's advocate. And Robert took the role of devil's advocate actually to vigorously argue against contemplated courses of action to force open group debate. So that was a really smart thing he did, and something more presidents, I think, should do. All right, so that's groupthink. We're going to switch here now. I just want to talk about say it, shout it, skip it quickly. This is something I'd like you to read. Now, it's couched this way. It looks like it's an assignment. It's not really an assignment unless you want it to be. I'd like you to just think about this, the difference between assertive, aggressive, and non-assertive communication, right? So obviously you've got groupthink, which a lot of times is a result of non-assertive discussions, right? Or folks who just rather not say anything because they are afraid of reprisal. So it's important to be assertive. Now, assertive and aggressive are similar but different. Assertiveness is a type of discussion, as you probably know, that is more mindful of the other, right? In other words, has some empathy involved, but still is focused on results for you and for others. So being assertive, right? Let's read this example here, the example below. And there's some examples, obviously, for each. But, well, okay, Bob, I thought you were supposed to, well, I guess I'll have to stay late and run the report for you tonight, so we'll have it for the meeting tomorrow, right? So that's non-assertive, and that's just somebody taking it, all right? Bob dropped the ball, as we can tell here, but the person's not willing to kind of take him to task on what he should have been doing, versus the assertive version of that, which is, Bob, we assigned action items so that everyone in the team could share the responsibility, and you said you would run the report, and we really need it for tomorrow's meeting. Perhaps you can either run it at lunchtime or stay a little later after work to complete it, right? So this person's taking this person to task in a polite way and offering solutions to get the job done based on what that person said they were going to do. So smart. That's a good example of assertiveness. Now, aggressive, obviously, Bob, you've been doing this type of thing ever since we started this project team. I knew we shouldn't have chosen you to be a part of something so important. I actually requested Tom. He's much more dependable. Look, if you don't have this report on my desk, error-free, and ready for the meeting by 8 a.m. tomorrow morning, you are going to wish you never joined this team or this company. So that's aggressive. And I've heard that plenty of times in my career. I'm sure you guys you've met people who do this kind of thing as well. Over the long haul, that's certainly not a good thing to do unless you are a ruthless dictator of sorts. So I would say the best course of action for the average person would be to go the middle route and be assertive and offer options and be supportive yet firm. Anyway, this will be referenced in our upcoming test, like we discussed. All right, let's talk quickly about active listening versus dialogic listening. So active listening first and foremost. This is great. Anybody can learn how to employ active listening skills, right? So it's really defined as providing both verbal and nonverbal cues that you're engaged in the conversation. That's really what it comes down to. The verbal messages have two components, content and underlying feelings and attitudes, right? That's kind of what drives active listening. And nonverbal stuff is like vocal hesitation, facial expressions, body posture, all that stuff you do with your body. Like, for example, in this case here, this picture, you got the woman who obviously is a doctor, is leaning forward and listening to the patient's concerns, right? That's showing good nonverbal sort of acuity there and showing that that person's engaged with the person talking, right? So it's verbal and nonverbal, right? In another way. But basically it's the same thing, right? So you're basically saying, you're regurgitating almost what that person said so they know you're following along. And that's a simple thing you can do as well. And by extension, I would say another thing you could do is to use the person's name in a statement. And I had a person who I used to work with long ago, a sales guy, who knew this rule. Actually, I don't know, it's not even a rule. It's not on here, but it's a neat thing to use that person's name. So for example, Joe, what you're saying is, or Bob, what you're saying is, if I got it correctly, right? Just use that person's name. It just shows, number one, you know the person's name. Number two, you're engaged in the conversation. So that's active listening. Now, dialogic listening is very similar, but one big key difference with dialogic listening, and we'll talk about that more when we get into this idea of empathy versus sympathy, okay? Is dialogic listening is a more joint process than active listening. In dialogic listening, listeners attend to their own views and the other person's views at the same time. Whereas active listening is really more about focusing on empathy, right? Empathy is, in other words, concern for the other person, right? In other words, how are they reacting to my message? And putting yourself in their shoes a little bit almost. So that's kind of the main difference here. So we'll go through this, but I think I wanted you to, if there's one takeaway between active listening and dialogic listening, it's that. Dialogic listening is more based on sympathy, and so I think, okay, I sympathize with you. In other words, I understand, appreciate what you're saying, but I can't really understand because it's not possible to feel what another person might feel. So my personal opinion is that's a lazy way to think about this stuff. Now, dialogic listening certainly has a lot of merit, and it focuses on things like authenticity and inclusion and confirmation and presentness, a spirit of mutual equality, etc., and even a supportive climate. But at the end of the day, it says that it's impossible for us to empathize with another person. Well, I disagree. I think it is it's possible to empathize, and it's something that's critically important in this day and age, right? So that's the main difference between the two. That dialogic listeners and the knock on people who believe in empathic listening say that it's not possible to be empathic, right? Because you just can't possibly be another person. Okay, so toward that now, how do you apply this stuff, right? How do you apply this to conflict management? So really the end game for us here in this class is if you're interested in doing this kind of work, it's great work, right? You can actually become a professional at doing this. So helping navigate conflict for people, right? Helping them walk through a conflict. And it's big business, right? And obviously communication folks can take this and run with it and make a career out of this. But a couple of things I want to share with you guys that you would do, and we're going to go into this more in module 4, where we break down conflicts and learn how to do that. But a couple things to set the table: controlling the environment and reducing noise. That's the first one, right? If you want to be in a quiet place and a neutral place, right? Now, conversely, if you want to put the screws to somebody, you can do that, and that's called interrogation. That's not what we're after here, right? We're looking for a neutral ground. Being totally present in the moment, obviously, that thing is, right? Just being aware. Now, you've seen many kind of lampoonings of people sitting with therapists and going through that where they just check out, right? So you've got to really be engaged and show them some of the things like active listening stuff, right? And empathy really plays a big part, I think, understanding both sides if you're negotiating the middle. Allowing the speaker to speak without interruption, that's a hard one for me. A lot of times my wife will tell me I interrupt way too much. So I'm working on that. And I think a lot of people have that problem. For me, it's like I got to get it out. Otherwise, I might forget it. But that's something I got to work on. And I think a lot of people do. But you got to get really good at not interrupting people if you're going to do this kind of work. Asking for help to understand the meaning of words. So if somebody says something like, let's say, for example, you're negotiating two business partners who use a lot of terminology you don't know, it's okay to ask for the meaning, right? And they'll explain that to you more than likely. And a lot of times that's a way of maybe kind of creating common ground. If they both think the same word, you can say, oh, we already agree. Take notes with the speaker's permission. Obviously, you want to ask for that. And I would say, and by extension, if you're going to record the meeting, which sometimes people do, as a way of taking notes, you want to make sure you get permission for that. And of course, and again, getting back to the clarifying questions here, two things you want to do to be aware of. You don't want to ask questions that are threatening in any way, right? In other words, questions that are not interrogation style. In other words, where were you the night of 9/11? That kind of thing, right? So we're not doing that. We, as much as possible, trying to play our Switzerland. A couple other things here with regard to conflict management, focusing on identifying what the issue is or the problem, the conflict. And again, Module 4 will break that down in more detail, but I want you to understand kind of the basics here. Obviously making frequent summaries of issues and facts again, and that's what you'll do. We're climbing a mountain here, right? So every time you have a chance, you want to summarize where we're at. So people get the feeling we're making progress, and you'll be the one to ultimately set the table for that. Identifying and remembering underlying feelings. So you'll pick up on things, body language, etc., where people will send the message, right? They'll have underlying feelings about certain topics, so you'll know, right? By extension, again, you want to acknowledge the speaker's feelings. And finally, not expressing any opinions or evaluations, right? Again, you are Switzerland. You're trying to be as neutral as possible. Now, it's really hard to be neutral on stuff. You may have an opinion about things, but again, you've really got to be neutral as possible. All right, so that one thing I want to mention, just last thing I want to talk about is study circles. How do you facilitate this? Now, this is a cool thing that evolved from Sweden in the 20th century as part of political movements, right? So the study circle is just what it sounds like. You see a circle here, right? And it's of people who want to discuss a topic or an issue. So in the United States, study circles discuss issues such as race relations, same-sex marriage, and immigration. So you see this still, not as much these days, but back in the 90s and 2000s, you saw a lot of this stuff kind of happen. But they're meant to encourage people to express their opinions and listen to others. And here's the key, right? It's facilitator-led. So you've got somebody who plays that role of Switzerland, or the person who's neutral to some degree, to maintain sort of an active, non-inflammatory dialogue. So you're facilitating that. Now, I've often seen people use like a ball of some kind where you're in a circle, and if you have the ball, you have the floor, right? And of course, if somebody wants the floor, they get the ball, and then of course, what that does is it eliminates or limits interruptions to some degree. So lots of tricks like that the book talks about, so I encourage you to read deeper into that. All right, let's move on now to Chapter 2. So that kind of wraps up on things we discussed last time, and some stuff. This stuff obviously you'll find in the upcoming test. We're going to break down Chapter 2, the second half, pages 35 to 49 now, and really what we're going to talk about is Western styles of conflict versus Eastern styles. In other words, and there was a disconnect, obviously. Look at the book. You talk about Western styles as being the end-all be-all to conflict. Well, obviously they didn't have, they were not the holy grail of conflict resolution, as we find out in the book, and obviously in history. This idea of harmony is really at the core of that. And then we're going to talk lastly about the goals of conflict coaching. All right, first Western style conflict, right? Obviously, baseball is a great example. I think you got a coach, and this is ubiquitous in baseball, but you always have that coach arguing with the umpire over a call, right? So that's typical for our culture, and obviously we are number one, right? USA all the way. Well, that's not the case elsewhere, right? Anyway, so it evolved that way, and we started out early on Deutsch's work with unidimensional view of responses, which is essentially saying, all right, it's either this or it's that. It's either this or it's that, and that's how you measured conflict, right? Well, come to find, it's a lot more diverse than slides. So I guess what I want to share with you now is this idea of a dual concern model, right? Which is really where the Thomas Kilmann conflict mode instrument evolved from, right? So whereas you had unidimensional views of responses, you now have something called dual concern, which involves 5 possible scenarios or styles. And I assume that everybody's got a go-to default style. So I'd like you to do now, as we discuss this, I'd like you to take stock in your own style as we read through this stuff here, right? But this is kind of the one you'll see most often. There's variants of this throughout the book, but this is the one we'll kind of refer to most often, right? So we'll start lower left quadrant there. The avoiding style, as we know, is the goal to delay a conflict of any kind. So just don't engage, right? Lower right, the blue rectangle, accommodating is the goal. The goal is there to yield, right? In other words, you're cooperating, but you're not assertive. Now the squishy middle, that red part, compromising, is the one most often people fall into because it's easy and it's fair and it's seemingly fair and it results in a solution in most cases. But maybe not. Maybe the solution, because you have to give something up, you have some bad feelings and it fosters future conflict. So compromising is, something we probably all have felt that we've gone through the most often. The goal is to find a middle ground somehow, and where each party has to give something up. Left-hand side is really, I've seen this a lot. My mother was actually very good at this, and she was very competing, and she's softened since, thankfully. But I adopted that and kind of had to unlearn that. But the competing style is what we do here in this country quite often. It's the goal to win at any cost, right? So at the expense of the other. And then, of course, there's collaborating, right? So the good example I use is, let's say you have two parties and one orange, and both parties want that orange. Well, come to find, if you do a little questioning and you ask key questions, you may find one party just wants the rinds because they use the rinds for the orange for cooking. The other party just finds oranges to be juicy and delicious, as I do. And so it's a win-win, right? But you wouldn't have known that had you not asked questions about that. So that's what collaborating is all about. It is the holy grail, frankly. It's not achievable in every case. However, I would say it's important to at least consider the collaborating style. And we'll talk more about where it kind of falls apart when you try to do collaboration, and maybe it's time to cut bait and go somewhere else. Here is another chart that's also in your... sorry, my dog's barking his head off if you can hear that. Another chart that kind of walks through these 5 quadrants in more detail, so I'm going to walk you through these quickly here. Lower left avoidance. The key there is focus on your own agenda. So it's, low, right? You don't focus on your own agenda very much, and even so, you don't focus on the relationship either. You just choose not to engage at all. Things you could say is like, forgot about it. Conflict? What conflict? Can we talk about this some other time, right? So you're pushing, delaying, and avoiding. Pretty common, right? Now, obviously, we talked about this again, the harmony versus avoiding piece. Now, in Western, non-Western cultures, we know that now as more preservation of harmony, right? Not just avoiding. Harmonizing, right? Another way of saying accommodating, right? And focus on your agenda is low, but focus on the relationships high. So in other words, and I've done some of this myself. I believe in harmony. I like doing that. I feel better when I know other people feel good about the decision made. And you say in this case, I lose, you win, right? Sure, I'm flexible, and you give up something, right? You're harmonizing. You're giving up maybe more in some cases because you can, or it's more important you to preserve that relationship, right? Directing now. This is more in keeping with focusing on your own agenda is high, and of course, focus on the relationship is low. So in other words, it's my way or the highway, right? And you don't really care as much about preserving that relationship, and that happens all the time in this country, and frankly, in businesses, in both politics and business. So we're doing it my way. Let's just get the job done. We'll worry about the relationship later, that kind of thing. So really not a lot of empathy going on there. Of course, in the squishy middle here, we got compromising, and we talked about, right, everything's medium, right? Everything's lukewarm. So focus on the agenda as medium, focus on the relationship as medium. I win some and you win some, right? So it's one part for each. I'll meet you halfway. Let's make a deal, or 2 examples, what you might say there. And last but not least, cooperating, which again is the win-win approach. Focus on the agendas high and focus on the relationships high. So again, you're trying to find that one key thing, that kind of one key approach. And a lot of times there are that approach, but not always, right? So it's win-win. Some examples, my preferences, and please tell me yours. If we each explain what we want and keep talking, we can find a way for us both. That's cooperating, okay? Now, let's talk about some challenges of collaboration. And obviously, it's the holy grail, like I've mentioned, right? But it's not always easy to achieve that. And here's some things the book talks about. Requires inventiveness and intelligence. So that's one thing. That's what I love about this profession. If you were to get into this, you do have to be kind of savvy and smart and kind of creative in achieving these goals. Second point, does not seem to have the excitement of competing. As we know, competing is fun. That's watching the Super Bowl, for example, we know there's going to be two teams playing, and it's going to be a fun, exciting match. But somebody's got to win, right? At the expense of the other. Parties have to want to collaborate. That's the other thing, and we'll talk more about that too. Not always do people want to collaborate. Let's say, for example, you got somebody who's got high power, a lot of prestige, and another person who doesn't. Now, it could go both ways, right? The person who has low prestige may want to avoid a conflict with somebody with high prestige because they could fire them or whatever. Conversely, a person with high prestige does not want to give credibility to the person with low prestige and can just ignore them altogether. And we'll talk more about that again in Module 4, where we talk about a guy by the name of Saul Alinsky, who talks about how to empower folks with low prestige or low power and how they can take power back from those parties who are basically stonewalling or ignoring them. Last but not least, most people are not trained for collaboration. That's why we're here, to understand that. You'll have enough information to be dangerous here with collaboration and how to kind of employ collaboration techniques. All right, so I'm not going to read this whole slide here. I just want to share with you that key thing we talked about is this idea of avoidance versus harmony, right? So this kind of evolved through the research, and it kind of changed things. But harmony, obviously, in the non-Western countries, is more a way to preserve the relationship, right? Versus just avoidance, simple avoidance. So that really kind of spawned some things, and Leung proposed 2 harmony motives to help address this discrepancy. So first one was, this idea of disintegration avoidance. In other words, you don't want to strain or weaken or eventually dissolve the relationship. So you're doing these things as a way of being passive, but yet trying to avoid disintegration of the relationship. And that's so preventing the negative, and of course harmony enhancement is the other side of it. Presuming that it's you wanting to strengthen the relationship, right? And that's kind of what it's seen as well. So either way, you can look at it both ways, and that's kind of how Leung kind of solved the problem. Now, there's more detail on that. I would say I encourage you to read that in the book, but you're not going to have that much detail, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, on the final exam. So, but just be familiar with that piece there. Now, this is a handout, obviously, in your book as well. I'm not going to read through this. I'd like you to just take stock in this and read these when you get a chance and find out which one of these is yours, right? So it's a quick way to figure out which style is your go-to style, your default. Now, you might employ different ones for different people, right, or different situations. For example, your family, you may be more assertive, but maybe at work, you're a little more avoidant for conflict. But either way, I'd like you to take stock in this and just get a feel for your own style. Here are some examples of each of those. Again, you could read this through. I'd like you to at least understand kind of when it's good to use these, because each one has a different one here. Of course, there's pitfalls for each as well. For example, let's look at the collaboration piece, right? In some cases, potential pitfalls for collaboration could be that you'll waste your time on something that's just really not important to collaborate on, right? So maybe sometimes you just got to make a decision and go with it versus really, really getting to the weeds with somebody on something to arrive at some solution. So it's one example of many, right? Just know that each of these styles has their perfect use situations and also potential pitfalls. All right, last slide here. We're going to talk about conflict coaching, which again is something you'll do, and it evolved in the 90s here in this country in a big way as a way of helping people manage disputes within corporate culture. So it happens interpersonally and also happens with company to company, right? So either way, it became very popular because there's a lot of that going on, right? And the goal was to, frankly, avoid bringing something to court because the courts were strained in a lot of cases. Good example of that, I'm just quickly going to tell you, my wife and I had a situation where, this is when we were young parents, new parents, we just got married, had a child, sent our kid to daycare, and that ultimately led to our kid being shaken by a care provider there. So long story short, it ended up we got accused of that, so because they didn't own up to it immediately, and we went to a court situation and then ultimately resolved in our favor, but it took a long time. And at the end of that, we had to meet with a negotiator, somebody who does this for a living, and that person neutrally helped us arrive at a solution that was amicable for both parties. But essentially it was us versus the daycare agency where she worked. So I thought that was a personal story. It was interesting, my first real experience with conflict theory and how it gets applied to these situations. But the main goal was to keep our court and many others out of the courts. All right, so that's a credible whack at the second half of Chapter 2 and groupthink and active and dialogic listening. But hopefully this is relevant to you, and I can tell you this: if you follow this along, you'll do incredibly well on the upcoming exam. Good luck with everything. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next week with another installment of Communication Conflict Resolution.